You are listening to Jesus the Overcomer podcast, and I'm your host, Caleb, and this is PT, Pastor Tim. And I just want to start off with the starter question I'm going to ask everybody who is on this podcast. The question is, who or what has impacted your walk with Christ?
Ooh, like the most?
Yeah.
The most? Wow, man. For me, probably both of my grannies. I know just growing up, it was, I grew up going to church because they would always make sure I was in church. Now, whether it was, and the crazy thing is, like, my mom and dad, they never went to church when I was growing up, but my grandma's always made sure I went to church anyway. So, and I think probably some of the most faithful people I've ever known in my life are both my Granny Fulcher and my Granny Suber. And to me, it's those values are instilled into me. And, just to see their faithfulness every single year of their life to Jesus and to the church, and just, trying to get other people to know who Jesus was. I mean, I look back on my life, and I know a lot of people say, you sure do talk about your grandmas a lot, in the services and the messages. But I mean, when I think about like a holy heritage, I think about both of my grandmas. And I don't think I'd be where I'm at today if it wasn't for them, their persuasion, their threats, and most of all their prayers, and I know they prayed for me. And yeah, so I wish I could shout out and say my mom and dad, but it was really my grandparents.
Yeah.
It really was. So.
Okay, so going off that question, I'm going to lean right into how church was related growing up. So was it a regular thing or occasional thing, like on holidays? Right.
So my younger years, it was all the time. I joke and say I had a drug problem, because my grandma always drug me to church, like every day of the week they were there serving, doing something. And it's kind of just like the old school mentality, So when the doors of the church were open and something needed to be done, they were there. They were serving. And I mean, they were servants until they went to see Jesus. When they drew their last breath, they were servants. And then I remember my teenage years. I had an encounter with God at Falcon Youth Camp when I was a teenager. And then I think what happened at Falcon Youth Camp, when I got back home, I went back to the same friends and everything back home, and I didn't know what happened. I didn't know how to process it because it wasn't ever explained to me. Mm-hmm. So then probably my teenage years and up into my early 20s, man, I ran from God, So it wasn't until 2002 that I dedicated my life back to Jesus. And whenever I did that, I haven't looked back since.
Right.
So that's been kind of my ride, you know what I mean? I actually gave my life to Jesus the week after Tracy and I got married. So we got married on April the 6th. We went to Cozumel for our honeymoon. We came back. And then I remember, a lot of people know my testimony. I came back from Bristol, Tennessee, and I went to church that Sunday morning because my grandmama asked me to be in church because my granddaddy was sick. And that's when I gave my life to Jesus, and I haven't looked back since, man. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more about that last week, before you got saved? Because that part of your testimony has always, I've been gravitated to, because it's so interesting, like how you went down that road for that week, and it was like the last 3 days, and then that led you to coming with Christ.
Yeah, I mean, I was the type of guy, I like to party, you know what I mean? And I'd go out with my friends, and we'd drink, and we'd smoke weed and do other things. And it just so happened a friend of mine had tickets. I used to go to NASCAR races and like NHRA drag races, and that's what we were in Bristol, Tennessee for NHR drag race. And I remember, man, we probably drank, oh man, it was terrible. I mean, Busch Light Draft, I'll never forget it. That was the beer. And we probably drank 40 plus beers, just me and him, and not to mention smoking the dope and everything else. And I just remember we left the racetrack on Saturday night, and we went back to the hotel. And whatever prompted, I know it was the Holy Spirit just prompted, the thought of, as I was laying in bed and I was watching the ceiling spin, I had the fleeting thought that I knew that if I was to die right then, that I would not go to heaven. Like, I knew I would bust hell wide open because I had been running from God, And I remember I said, nope. So, I mean, I literally got up and got a ride from Bristol, Tennessee to Fayetteville, North Carolina that night. And then I remember, man, I probably still smell like a brewery when I went up in church, like, honest to God, So, I mean, I know what it's like to go down the wrong path, and it wasn't that it was malicious or anything. It was just, that's just what I did, But I remember, man, I showed up to service, and that morning, the preacher preached a message. It was pretty much fire and brimstone, and man, I knew right then and there that I was there for a reason. And then plus too, in the back of my mind, my granddaddy was on his deathbed, So, and then he accepted Christ while he was on his deathbed. So he never went to church with my grandma. He never. He wasn't abusive or drinking or none of that stuff. I mean, he was a good man, as far as, everybody's standards. But I remember the same pastor that led me to Jesus, back to Jesus, was the same pastor that led my papa to Jesus on his deathbed. And I had given my life to Jesus that Sunday. And then Monday they called the family in, and we were there, and isn't it Pastor Wiley Hughes from Fayetteville, North Carolina, I remember him asking my granddaddy, Lewis, you're getting ready to draw your last breath, where are you going? Mm-hmm. And, I got mixed emotions about all that, because I'm like, man, I could just think if my papa was served with my grandma, to Jesus, how much crazier it would have been. But I mean, he gave his life to Jesus on his deathbed, So, I mean, it's just all kinds of emotions when I think back to those days. He prayed the sinner's prayer, and he had tears coming out of his eyes. And then I remember the next morning, I had went to work on Tuesday, and they called and they said, look, your granddaddy, we think he's about to die, hospice. So literally the next day after he gave his life to Jesus, the family showed up. He was non-responsive. They had one of the hospital beds like inside the living room. So he sat straight up and he called my grandmama mama. He said, Mama, come here, give me a kiss. She gave him a kiss, and then he drew his last breath just like that. So I mean, I know I'll see him again one day, and it's like a lot of things happen. I just got married. I gave my life back to Jesus. My granddaddy died, so it was a lot going on at the time that I did give my life back to Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned about your grandfather, because my grandfather was actually battling with cancer when I gave my life back to Christ here at New Life. Right. So it's just interesting how, like, something like that, your family's going through a lot, and it makes you realize, like, it's all or nothing. Like, give your life, or you might never experience it again. Yeah.
I mean, I remember when I went to see your granddaddy, he'd already taken a bad turn for the worse, and it was really fast, but yeah, so I mean, you know the whole emotion, and then I just remember vividly, at my papa's funeral, and this is how crazy God works, man. Like it makes me want to jump and shout, because it's so awesome. We had a mechanic, so I worked with a family company called Fulcher Electric in Fayetteville. And my granddaddy was, of course, the president until he died, and my grandmama, took over and all that stuff. But we had a mechanic that we would always carry our bucket trucks and stuff to. And man, he was a hellion, Like he was like, you would go and he would be snorting cocaine like off of the hood of the truck at like 6 o'clock in the morning. Like he was a biker, like the roughest dude you can imagine, you know, like for real, you know. And this is how crazy it is. After I gave my life to Jesus, I had to carry a truck to him like the next day, and he said, "Well, I heard you done gave your life to the Lord." You know, like he was mad about it that I did it, you know. Mm-hmm. But then I remember at my papa's funeral, man, you know, we sang hymns, and I mean, it was like an old school Pentecostal funeral. I mean, it was off the chain, you know. But I remember that Pastor Wiley did an altar call at my papa's funeral, and George Benton, the hellion mechanic, gave his life to Jesus at my papa's funeral, and now he's preaching up in the mountains somewhere. Like, it's so crazy, man, just to see how God works in people's lives. And, you know, I think back, like, all that going on, but it still goes back to my grandma's faithfulness.
Yeah.
You know, because he saw how, my papa saw how my grandma lived her life, and he knew. And then the same thing, you know, George saw how my grandmama lived her life, and you know, my papa would always look out for George, you know, and it kind of just, it happened that day. And just to know that through his death, that there's somebody right now in the mountains preaching the gospel of Jesus. And it was like, like if you could have picked anybody else at the funeral, you would have never picked this dude, like never. But he stood up, man, because it's surreal when you're at a funeral. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, that day's going to come for all of us unless the rapture happens first.
Right.
So you really have to process a lot of thoughts and a lot of, you know, like, where am I at, really? You know, if I was to die today, really, where would I go? And I remember, man, that's why whenever I do a funeral, I always do an altar call at a funeral. Always. Because I've seen people give their life to Jesus at funerals. And I'm telling you, George is a testament to that. Yeah. So I know that's probably a lot more than you wanted.
No, that's perfect. The next question would be like, when did you feel your calling to be a pastor of a church, and how did that come about?
Wow, I still don't know if I feel that call yet. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No. Man, it's strange. Because, you know, I had my first big experience with God at Falcon Youth Camp when I was a teenager. And then, like I said, I ran, you know. And after I gave my life back to Jesus, you know, I got heavily involved in the church at Baywood Church in Fayetteville. And I actually became the youth pastor at that church. So every year I would always volunteer and be a counselor at Falcon Youth Camp because it was important to me because, you know, that's where I had my big God experience. And I remember we were at the Falcon Youth Camp when it was the old building, and man, worship was going on, and I heard God just as clear as the plain, you know, just as plain as day is clear. He said, "You're going to preach my gospel," and it took me a minute to really process what that meant because, you know, sometimes you think you hear from God, and it's not God, but when you know, you know. And it took me a minute to process like what that meant, you know. And I'm like, wait a minute, you want me, God, you know? And ever since that night, I knew I was called. I knew He called me. And so, and this is the other crazy thing. I'll give you this part of my testimony, and y'all gonna hear more about it Sunday morning because I was thinking about it today. Just talking about faithfulness and being faithful. I remember, man, God called me, and I'm like, man, I don't know that much about the Bible. Like I had recently just given my life back to Christ. And, you know, I always had like a unnecessary pressure that I had to know all the answers, and I had to know everything, and I had to be articulate, and I had to make sure, you know, everything was perfect. And it's so crazy. And I was like, well, I got to go to Bible college. Like, right? Like, that's, you got to go to Bible college, you know. And technically you don't, but it's a good thing to do. But I remember I was a foreman at the time at our family business, and I went to Heritage Bible College because it was about 15 minutes driving from my house, Fayetteville to Dunn. And I went and I registered for class before I even talked to my uncles or anybody about work. And I was going to have to be in class Thursday evening at 6 o'clock, and I was going to have to miss every Friday. And I was like, this is crazy, man. So I went and I registered. I paid for a full semester, right? And I said, I got to do it. Whatever it takes, I got to do it, because I just knew in my heart, man, that's God had called me, and I felt like that's what I had to do. So I went and talked to my uncle, and my uncle was like, you're crazy. You're crazy. How do you know God called you? Like, all these questions, how do you know this? How do you know this? And he was like, well, what are you going to do about work? And I said, well, I got to be back and done by 6 o'clock on Thursday every week. And he was like, that's impossible. That's impossible. He was like, well, you're going to have to give up being a foreman. You're going to have to give up your company credit card, your gas card, your work truck. You're going to have to go back to being like a grunt. You know what I mean? And I said, well, if that's what I got to do, that's what I got to do. And just me saying that just really made him more angry, because he just didn't understand, But I remember, dude, that was like on a Friday. So he called me into his office. First thing, we had to be at work at 6 o'clock in the morning. So as soon as I walked in, my other boss, Sean, was like, Ken needs to see you. You need to go upstairs. And I was like, well, I guess they're getting ready to fire me, right? Like, whatever. And really in my heart, I was like, it's going to be what it's going to be, whatever. I know God's got it. And I went upstairs, and when I walked in, man, he was in just a ball, crying, his eyes out. And I'm like, what in the world is going on? Like, what is happening? And he looked at me, he said, you whatever it takes for me to get you through Bible college, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to take this stuff away from you. God woke me up in my sleep last night and told me that I had to do everything you needed me to do to get you through Bible college. Wow. So, and literally I was like, okay. And I just left the office, but like, it's just, God called me. I stepped out on faith on a Friday without even talking to my boss, because I knew in my heart that's what I had to do. That's what I felt like the Spirit of God was leading me to do. I went and did it, not knowing what was going to happen. And that Monday morning when I showed up to work, I was like, well, I might get fired. I might be out here being a grunt or whatever. I don't know what's going to happen. But then to get called in his office and he tell me that God woke him up the night before and said, whatever it takes to help you get through Bible college, I'm going to do it. Like, that's God at work. That's just totally crazy.
Yeah.
So
that's awesome. The next question following with that last one was, people who are looking or questioning what their call or purpose is, what is some advice that you could give them?
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the biggest questions I get asked a lot, because I think we're one of the anomaly churches where everybody wants to serve at New Life. Like, everybody wants to get plugged in. So many people want to help, and I got so many people that are new converts that have just given their life to Jesus, and that's one of the biggest questions I get is what am I supposed to be doing? Mm-hmm. Like, what now? And I tell people, look, I'll tell you something that I need you to do, but whether that's the call God has for your life or not is I'm not sure. So I would tell anybody that has those questions, God speaks to us, definitely through prayer, definitely through the Word of God. And then I think, once you hear from God, whether He speaks to you directly through prayer or through His Word, there's always going to be confirmation from somebody else on the outside. So I tell a lot of people, if you feel something in your spirit and you feel God, the Holy Spirit prompting you to do something, you're going to get confirmation from an outside source. That's the way it's been my whole life. It's just always confirmation from somewhere else, So, and then that's the biggest thing. A lot of people don't understand the gifts of the Spirit. They don't understand, their gifting. A lot of people think that to make an impact, that you got to be a pastor or you got to do something, and it's not the case. Everybody's got a role to play in the kingdom of God. And you're going to reach people that I can't reach. And I'm going to reach people that you can't reach. And same thing with anybody else, The biggest thing about a call is obedience. Hands down. Because what I have learned through my years of walking with God is He'll prompt you to do some stuff that don't make any sense whatsoever. I mean, He'll prompt you to just go talk to a total stranger, or just, give somebody $5 or just go pray for this person or, carry a meal to this house. Or, I've had friends that God just put on my heart. And for whatever reason, I was like, I ain't going to call them, God. It's like 12 o'clock at night. This is stupid. I'm not going to call. And I'm like, no, okay, you want me to call? I'm going to call. is just the obedient. I call and they had a gun barrel in their mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And I always think if I wasn't obedient, you know, where would my friend be at? You know, so anybody that feels called by God to do something, really listen, because prayer is a two-way communication. It's not, you're just not rambling off a wish list to heaven. You know, you really got to, you know, that's fine. You approach the throne of God boldly with, you know, you petition heaven and all that. But at the same time, you know, I always, in my prayer time, I always have a pause and just silence, because I really want to sit there and hear from God. And then reading this word, I always get spoke to through God's word. And then, you know, if you're not sure of your call, just do whatever it is the Spirit leads you to do through obedience. You know, a lot of people, obedience is our responsibility. The outcome is God's. You know, so and then don't overthink it. It's probably another good one.
Yeah.
You know, because some people just overthink, and like we talked about last night at church, some people don't feel like they're qualified. Some people are scared. You know, I don't have all the answers. No, you'll never have all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're obedient, you just start somewhere. I promise you, God will lead you through the Spirit to do whatever it is He's called you to do.
That's awesome. I know for when I felt called to do this podcast, it was at our first men's encounter.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got back from it, I called my mom like right away and told her that God put this podcast in my spirit I need to do, but I don't know how to start it. I don't know where to start from. So I prayed about it. I prayed about it for about a year. And then I was in a worship service, and God was like, you need to partner up with the church, because there's so many people in the church who have a story that needs to be told, because that's their only way that they're going to reach people.
Right.
And then I talked to my dad, and then I talked to you, and like everything went so smoothly. That's how I knew it was like, it was
Right.
God, because
Right.
I didn't know where to start. But every time I went out and talked to somebody, it went just the way it needed to go. And now we're here.
And here we are, man.
Yeah.
The inaugural podcast. This is awesome, man. We made it. We made it, dude. You did it. And see, and it's because you were obedient to what God called you to do that this has even happened. You know? So, yeah.
So going off of those questions, I want to go right into your battle with anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Because personally, I battle with anxiety, and that's something that I thought was amazing about seeing you, was you were so transparent with your battle and struggle with anxiety that it made me just want to, you know, not give up. Because anxiety can make you feel crippled. It can make you feel like you can't do anything. And just seeing that you were on stage and you were preaching the word and you were so open about it, and anytime you struggled with during that week, you would like tell the people in the audience. And I just want you to like kind of tell a little bit about that. And then also, when you start feeling anxious, what are some things that you do to fight that anxiety?
Right. You know, and I don't even know if I've said this from the platform or not, but, you know, the thought of death triggered my first panic attack. Mm-hmm. You know, because I don't know what it was. I just like, oh crap, I'm gonna die. You know, like it's like all of a sudden a realization. You know, and the crazy thing is, it's like, okay, but I know where I'm going to go. But even having eternal security, still, it's hard to process. You know, so that's the thought that brought on my first panic attack. And what I've learned is a lot of people, that is the same trigger for them too. You know. And for me to be open about it, it's a two-edged sword, you know, because some people want a pastor that's polished, that, you know, people think he has it all together, you know, like clean cut, you know, wear a suit and tie and all this, and that's fine, you know. I have nothing, because that's what my pastor was when I grew up. But I grew up thinking that my pastor had it all together and he never had any problems, and there was, you know, he was perfect. And I'm like, well, I can never be like that, you know. So I guess early on in my ministry, I was just like, you know, if I got something going on, it's cheaper than therapy just to tell people what you're going through, you know?
Right.
And what I realized is, I mean, to me, it was a gamble, really. Like, man, should I just be transparent about it and let people know that this is what I got going on in my life, you know? Of course, I had all the, you know, what people gonna think about you, and you know, and all that type stuff. But what I learned, man, is through my journey with anxiety, I have been able to help so many other people because I have been transparent about it.
Right.
You know, and then for whatever reason, I thought that I was the only person that had anxiety. But what I learned is there's a lot of other people that have anxiety. You know, and for me to be transparent on stage, it's important to me because I want other people to know that they're not by themselves in the struggle. You know, because that's what the enemy had tried to make you think, is that you're by yourself and it's just you. And you know, if he can keep you isolated, he keeps you trapped. He keeps you, you know, kind of locked in this false prison that you don't need to be in. I mean, my anxiety was so bad, you know, I didn't know what else to do. So of course I went to the doctor, you know, and they prescribed me, you know, some medication. And even growing up, man, in the Pentecostal churches, you didn't take medicine for anything, you know. So here I am, a pastor taking, you know, antidepressants and Xanax for anxiety. It's like, that's a double whammy, and you know, in some circles, you know. But you know, I thank God that I had a Christian doctor, you know, who really explained things to me well. And you know, he was like, look, if you need medication, you need medication. You know, it's to help, you know. So I was on Lexapro, and then I took Xanax as needed. And I don't, you know, I didn't want to take Xanax, and I don't like taking and all that stuff because, you know, I'm scared, like, what if I get addicted? You know, like, that's a huge thing for me, and that's probably like a weird fear that I don't even have to have. But the doctor was like, well, anytime you feel a panic attack, just take you a Xanax. Well, if I take a Xanax, dude, I go right to sleep. And I'm like, dude, I work in the middle of the street, you know, for the city of Rocky Mountain. I'm like, I'm out there hanging up stoplights and stuff. I can't do that. I'll get killed. You know, like, this ain't going to work. So I stayed on the Lexapro probably 6 months. And then I just really, through my battle with anxiety, I have grown the closest to God I've ever been in my life. And, you know, and the way I cope and deal now is totally different than what I used to, you know. And just to realize that, you know, mental illness is a big thing, you know, and people that do have anxiety and panic attacks and things, you know, of that nature, it's important to be able to have somebody to talk to, you know. And this the other thing about just telling people about my experience is, you know, whenever I first started telling people I had anxiety, you know, you get the stuff like, well, just don't have it. Right. You know, like, well, you know, well, why are you panicking for? Don't panic. You know, like, if you've never had anxiety, you don't know what it's like. And, you know, so anybody who's listening to this podcast that don't have anxiety, and you know somebody that does have anxiety, don't be that person to say don't have anxiety, because it doesn't work. It's not helpful at all. And the crazy thing about it is, as soon as Tracy and I got married, probably in 2004, we carried her to the hospital because we thought she was having a heart attack. And then come to find out, she had a panic attack. And then she was suffering from anxiety. Well, she got off, you know, she learned how to cope and all this stuff, you know, and she was on medication. She got off medication. And so when she was having anxiety, I didn't understand it. So I was that person, you know, well, babe, just don't have anxiety, you know, like, what are you worried about? You know, like, no big deal. But then whenever I had mine, I thank God, and she thanks God that she went through it so she could help me get through mine. So what I've learned is just being open about it, because I've been able to help so many other people get through what they're going through with anxiety, you know. So, yeah, it's a two-edged sword, but I think it's part of my testimony.
Right.
You know, it's part of who I am. And I'm not ashamed of it, you know. I really am not. Because I've been able to help so many other people, man, go through what I went through. And I thank God now, you know, I'm not on any medication now. I thank God for it, that during that time I took it because I needed it. And then I really got to a point where I was able to cope and deal with stress and other things better. So I got off of the medication. you know. So that's kind of where I'm at now, you know. And I still get times where I feel real anxious.
Right.
And I still have panic attacks here or there. They're nowhere near as severe because I can identify like triggers. I can identify certain feelings in my body. Whenever I feel the fight or flight response, I know how to cope differently.
Right.
You know, so at first when it first hits you, you don't know any of these things, so it's really bad. But then once you go through it and you learn, you know, because everybody's anxiety symptoms are different. There's some that are the same, but everybody experiences anxiety in people's bodies does different things, you know. So now one of my biggest identifiers whenever I feel like I'm anxious or real stressed or whatever is I get chronic muscle knots. You know, so used to I would think, oh God, I got a blood clot, or you know, something, and that would make anxiety worse. You know, like you get a random pain, you're like, oh, I'm about to die. You know, this is crazy. But now I'm like, okay, no, you're just anxious. Your body's in fight or flight. You got cortisol going through your veins and adrenaline, and it's how to cope with that now. And I'm like, okay, now I get a foam roller or a lacrosse ball and I massage the knot out, you know, and I keep going. But some of the ways that I cope now, I work out more than I ever have. I go to the gym 3 to 4 times a week. That's kind of my time to unplug my brain. You know, I just put me some praise and worship on. I'm in there, or either techno, one of the two. It's got to be one of the two. You know, something to drive. You know, and then I work out, and then I train Jiu Jitsu, which really helps because when you're in there, somebody's trying to kill you. You really can't think of nothing but staying alive. You know. And then breathing is probably one of the biggest things when it comes to anxiety because you don't know that your breathing pattern is off whenever you have the fight or flight response in your body. So doing breathing techniques. So I'm just going to say this because it's going to help somebody. I know it. It's just a 4 count. So deep breath, count of 4, like 1, 2, 3, 4, breathe in, breathe in, breathe in. Then hold it for 4 count, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Do that over and over and over and again because that kind of resets your whole nervous system. So breathing's a big part, you know. So I feel like anybody that you feel anxious or panic or whatever, when you have to tell your body to calm down, and that breathing makes your body calm down. So yeah.
Well, those are some really good tools to use. I know for me, when I get anxious, I put on praise and worship. Because that seems to settle my mind, and then it never fails when I put on praise and worship. I put it on shuffle. There's gonna be a song that is gonna be about what I'm thinking.
Right.
And
right.
It just helps a lot when I done it this week because I've been a little anxious about starting this. So
yeah,
it just helps to put on that praise and worship. Listen to it, worship a little bit, and let your mind just settle.
And there's a spiritual component to the anxiety too. You know, it really is. We're all in spiritual warfare, and I feel like now, with everything we got going on here at New Life, and just you know what God is doing, and just seeing the lives change. I mean, the enemy's really mad. You know, right. and I'll just say this, and it might freak everybody out that's listening, but it's okay. I know Tuesday morning I woke up and it was about 3:45 in the morning, and usually that's when I wake up is around that time. I woke up, my heart rate was really fast. I was like, man, what is going on? You know, this is crazy. So what I did is I just felt like there was another presence in the room, and it wasn't God. You know, and I think the spiritual warfare aspect of anxiety was happening Tuesday night. So I got up out of bed, I started praying, reading the Bible, and I just turned on praise and worship music, man, until, you know, I felt like I had peace about going back to sleep. And then when 30 minutes later, it was fine. But you bringing up the praise and worship thing, there is a spiritual battle component to it. You know, and another thing about anxiety and the spiritual battle is I see more children dealing with it now than ever before. You know, so yeah, I mean, I think somebody needs to understand that too. There is a spiritual component about it because we are under attack from the enemy.
I know also with my spiritual gift, I can feel other people's emotions. And this actually happened Sunday. The person I was sitting beside, I felt them being anxious, and I started being anxious. And I was like, why am I anxious? There's nothing going on.
Right.
I mean, my dad was preaching, but like, I wasn't anxious about that. And it took me about 10 minutes to figure out that the person beside me was anxious because both of his legs were shaking. And then I remembered, because I know him personally, that he does battle with anxiety. And I just started praying for him. And as I was praying, that anxiety started going away. But it's me feeling that makes me know, like, if it's not me, then it's somebody around me.
Right.
And then it helps me to either pray or speak in their life. So I can't really explain it, but it happens.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I'm going to move on to another topic. So, when I was getting my questions ready for you, something in me was like, kept taking me back to some of the sermons you preached recently. And the biggest one that you preached recently that had touched my life was we've been learning about the I am statements and the I am statement of consistency. Consistency is actually my word for 2023.
Nice.
And that was before you even preached on it.
Wow.
So that sermon was all for me because I need to work on being consistent. But I want you to kind of explain a little bit about why is it important to be consistent.
Yeah, well, the whole series we've been doing is pre-decide. So we're pre-deciding ahead of time what we're going to do when situations arise, so we don't have to deal with them when we're emotional, when we're not thinking straight. And that's one of the things about life. Discipline and consistency. They go hand in hand, but they're not the same thing. But they kind of are the same thing.
Right.
So just being consistent in your walk with Christ. If you set up structure that you are going to get up every day and pray, that you are going to get up every day and read your Bible, that you are going to walk purposely, that you are going to go to work and give everything you have at your job, because that's what God calls us to do everything to glorify Him. Like, you have to set precedents in place, so if you have a bad day, you're still going to do the things to keep you consistent with God. So and that was the whole point. It was about the fact that Jesus said that I am the vine and we're the branches. And a lot of times we allow life and things that happen in our life to separate us from the vine. And when you're separated, that's when you're vulnerable. That's where the enemy wants you. But if you say, okay, no matter what kind of day I'm going to have today, when I get home in the afternoon, I'm still going to put some praise and worship on, and I'm going to pray and just praise God. Like, and we use Daniel for an example too, because he'd already pre-decided he was going to pray no matter what was going to happen. So if you have consistency in your walk with Christ, I think it helps you grow closer. So if you have a bad day or you get a bad doctor's report or whatever bad might happen, that you're so consistent with doing the things that keeps you close to God that it's not going to faze you. So yeah.
The other thing is, so I know that you do martial arts. The funny thing is, me and my brother have a little nickname for you. We call you the black belt pastor.
Nice.
We actually thought about like getting you a T-shirt that has it up there. But that takes a lot of dedication, and when you are sticking to it, and it's extremely painful and hard, how do you stick to it?
Yeah. One thing about Brazilian Jiu Jitsu is we got a saying in Jiu Jitsu that some days that you're the hammer and some days you're the nail. So some days you show up, and I mean, you're in there and you're rolling and fighting, and man, you're just taking somebody to the cleaners. I mean, it's awesome, but then some days you're the one getting taken to the cleaners. So the thing about jiu-jitsu is it's more mental than anything. It's a mental game, because I'm trying to think 3, 4, 5 moves ahead what you're going to do, and then I want to make you react to what I'm doing to set you up for the 4 or 5 things down the road. So you have to constantly think, and then you're constantly changing position. So every time you change a position, then you got to regroup and you got to think ahead even much more. And one of the things about jiu-jitsu is, there's a very small percentage of people that make it to black belt. Like, it's a crazy small percentage. Because it took me 13 years to get my black belt.
Mm-hmm.
And that was training 3, 4, 5 days a week, constantly. But it was just mentally, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do this. Even when you go in there and you just get your tail whooped, man. Those are the nights you want to just pack your stuff up and go home and like, I'm never coming back. But it made me mentally have the fortitude to say, no, tomorrow's a new day. I'm going to regroup and I'm going to do better than I did yesterday.
Yeah.
And just having that mentality that I'm not going to stop. I'm hard-headed, man. I'm a glutton for punishment. And I think that's a good quality for me to have, even in ministry, because there's some days, man, church folks will beat you up,
Yeah.
And it's just the nature of it, man. It's just the nature of it. And some days, like, literally, I'm like, man, forget this. This is ridiculous. But, I think even training jiu-jitsu's helped me in ministry, because I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep fighting, and so jiu-jitsu's taught me a lot, man. And then another thing in jiu-jitsu's, we got a saying that you train injury to injury. So you're always hurt because it's such a physical martial art. So, you might have a hurt shoulder, so I can't use this shoulder tonight, I got to use something else, or my knee's hurt, or my back's hurt, or whatever it is. So, yeah, it's just not giving up. And then the other thing, like, I tell people that I have brothers, and they're my jiu-jitsu family, especially right now, we got 6 black belts, and we all started except for our professor at the same time. And we wouldn't let each other quit.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm like, man, I'll die for these dudes because they've always had my back. Nights I'm like, man, forget this. I'm not coming back. They're like, yes, you are. I'm coming to get you tomorrow. You're coming back. We're going to do this. We're going to do this together. So, just like Pastor Dylan and Pastor Jessica and Pastor Kevin and Pastor Misty and, even Brooke and everybody that supports me as a pastor here, it's good that God has all these people in place because they support me too. Like, no, we're in this together. We're going to finish this thing. So, yeah, it's been a long journey, but it's good. It's taught me a lot.
Awesome. Well, that's pretty much all the questions that I have for you. You covered everything I wanted you to cover.
Cool, good.
So, I'm just going to go ahead and end it, and thank you for being on as my first
Absolutely,
guest.
man. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.